So Battle Cats in its whole decade run always had their different fair share of non-uber meta units. There's always those certain units that you're just gonna bring in every lineup possible because of how good they are. Nowadays we got the well-known meta units like Courier, Slime, Can Pizza, and so on, but a long time ago, and for the longest time, Paris Cat was the one sole dominator of the meta units in Battle Cats. Paris has been around for the longest time. She was first introduced in version 2.0 back in 2013. Paris, or her base form Salon Cat, is a common rare gacha unit that you can get from any banners, making it a unit that most people in mid-game would have. Paris Cat is somewhat of a copy of Sexy Legs Cat, and more accurately, Actress Cat. All three of these units having identical range, attack rate, and cooldown. The main differences are that Paris Cat and Actress Cat have an area attack and having pricier cost at 900, where Sexy Legs have 600 and is also only single target. Also, a funny detail is that Paris and Actress variants, when spawned together with Sexy Legs variant, are specifically programmed to always visually stack up on top of each other, so that if they were standing at the exact same position, it would look like as if their body has merged into one big cat. I've also talked about how this works in a very old video regarding unit layering and how Battle Cats handles unit position visually, so give it a watch if you're interested. Now, Paris Cat frankly is a very simple cat. She doesn't even have any ability, but she didn't need any abilities to be good because her stats is all that she needs. At first glance, Paris' stats are actually not that crazy impressive. Even by the standards of years back, her stats isn't even that high compared to most other units. But the one main thing that really stands out when it comes to Paris Cat is her extremely short 2 seconds cooldown. When it comes to being a proper range area attacker, there is basically no cat unit in the game this spammable. Sure, there's also Actress Cat or other Sexy Legs variant that also have a similar cooldown, but Paris Cat has the best stats out of them all, having the highest damage output while being an area attacker. Even Actress's true form, Beefcake, cannot really compete with Paris' damage output. Maybe she's comparable to Drama Cats, who actually has a better stats than Paris. But Drama has a 7 seconds cooldown, which is 3 times less spammable than Paris Cat, and yet Drama already is on the realm of one of those units with a relatively short cooldown. Paris' immense spammability combined with her solid standing range allows her to stack up incredibly fast and survive for a good amount of time. Paris is a one-of-a-kind for being a proper, extremely spammable ranged area attacker. This was true back then, and it's still true even now. Her extremely short cooldown means you never need to worry about your range attackers going into cooldown. This makes it so that you always have a range attacker ready, so that you don't need to bring too much other units in your lineup, and you can have more space to bring other utility or support units. Paris was really good. Really solid stats, really short cooldown, allowing for a big swarm of solid attacker and a great standing range to boot. But of course, this doesn't come with a cost, literally. Paris Cat is an extremely pricey cat for what it's worth. I mean, 900 isn't that much. Drama Cats or Weightlifter or other similar range area attackers are also pricier or at least at a similar cost, but Paris Cat really relies on her low cooldown to actually be utilized properly. You want to spam Paris Cat for her to be effective, but 2 Parises is already 1,800 cost. That's kind of a lot. You can get units with much better impact with your money. Spamming her every 2 seconds would drain your wallet extremely fast, but not spamming her would be kind of a waste to actually bring her at the first place. If you don't have the money to spam her, you're probably better off bringing units that are more cost efficient. This isn't too much of a problem in early mid-game stages though, especially in Stories of Legend chapters, where they would often just spam a big amount of enemy that drops big cash like Dark Doges or Moot or Seal or Celeboodles and such, so you wouldn't really run out of cash that quickly. Plus, Paris' 350 range also outranges majority of early game boss enemies. This includes Owlbrows, Moot, Raindy, The Face, Ashna, and so on. One of her best stage, for example, is Star Ocean. Star Ocean consists of Ashna as the boss and a huge spam of Dark Doges that increases in number as time goes on. This stage essentially gives the player infinite money with constant Dark Doges, so you can just spam Paris like no tomorrow. Paris outranging Ashna makes it so that you can shred him incredibly fast even with the constant Dark Doges trying to protect him, and the Dark Doge swarm can get overwhelmed by the big stack of Paris Cats. Not only that, she was also one of the main meta units for wave enemies. Enemies like Cory, Dober, hell even stuff like Crazed and Manic version of Gross and Titan was a big pain back then due to the lack of wave immune units, and wave blockers were just straight up not a thing that existed. In this case, having a range stack spam is the way to go. By only spamming range attackers without meat shielding, you can repel wave enemies without it doing too much wave attacks. Paris is extremely good at this, as her range is actually pretty high, and her low cooldown means that you're gonna have her ready to repel any other enemies that may come with the waivers. Paris spamming is very effective in this case. There's a lot of other notable stories of legend stages where she works absurdly well, and so for the longest time, she's considered to be a must-have unit for most players. Later in update 6.9, nice, Paris also gains a true form, Cyborg Cat. Cyborg's improvement is just more damage, that's about it. Oh, and also weakened immunity, which was meant to be used to counter Wing Piggy, but we'll get into that later. So her true form changes are very minor, but actually that's kind of all she needed at the time, really. She just needed more damage to scale better through the latter parts of the game, since she's already pretty strong as is. She still is the go-to area attacker for most players. At this point though, she already had a rival in the mid-ranger department. Back in version 5.5, a fellow rare unit, Cat, gains her true form, Cameraman Cat. Cat in the previous form was a slow single-target melee unit with strong versus floating, but Cat was really bad. She can't outrange anything, and she's way too slow for rushing. She doesn't have any health and whatsoever to tank, and while she does have an extremely short 3.8 seconds cooldown and a 50% chance to survive an extra hit, her stats just doesn't allow her to do anything. However, the true form Cameraman gains some simple but very effective changes. Her health and speed is improved, which is neat, but the one biggest change is her improvement of range from 190 to 250. Although this is still 100 under Cyborg, 250 is now actually enough to outrange most melee enemies like Gories or Pengs or Bun Bun variants. The survive lethal ability is also now much more impactful since she can actually outrange enemies, so she can stack up. Compared to Cyborg, Cameraman has similar health but better damage and only costing 540, almost half of Cyborg's 900. Not to mention, Cameraman has better health and damage towards floating enemies, making her able to shred short-range floating enemies like Brolos or Bun Bun variants extremely effectively. Camera still lacks in range, but on stages where you just want any kind of mid-rangers for melee enemies, Cameraman is more often the better pick. While Camera does have a longer cooldown, her cooldown is still very short, and you can also just use Research Combo to offset this cooldown disadvantage. I have a video about how good Research Combo is, give it a watch if you're interested. But yeah, Cyborg's cast drainage is still a big problem after all, and it's often worth trading Cameraman's shorter range for being a much more cost-efficient unit. Cyborg still found usages here and there, after all, her range is still really good. But Cameraman starts to climb up the ranks in being one of the more used common rare mid-ranger attacker unit. As time goes on and on, modern stages nowadays also starts to rarely ever give you a huge sum of money for you to splurge randomly. Stages starts to focus more on countering generic range attackers with LD or Omni Strike or Wave or Surge and such, that eventually even Cameraman starts to lose relevancy as well. A lot of more modern stages demands tankiness, demands cost efficiency, demands speed, demands rushing capabilities, a lot of things that Cyborg cannot really provide. And even though generic stages that demands generic area attackers still exist, Cyborg's cost is still an issue. There's modern alternatives that can fill in what Cyborg can do without sucking your wallet dry. At version 10.6, she was given talents, and it's not terrible, but maybe it could be better. Her two most helpful talents is the Survive Lethal talents and the Toxic Immunity talent. Survive Lethal at max gives her a 50% chance to survive an extra hit, similar to what Cameraman can do. This is pretty pricey to max out, but it does allow her to be effectively more cost efficient as she survives in the field longer, making her more worth the cost. Survive Lethal is honestly a godsend talent to give to literally any range attackers. This is like the ideal talent for basically any generalist, and it fits her perfectly. The Toxic Immunity talent, while it's decent, rarely ever comes to play as toxic enemies are generally rare. Not to mention some toxic enemies like Zolo or Oldstrich still has an incredibly high base damage that would just straight up kill Cyborg in 1 or 2 hits even without the toxic effect coming into play. Other toxic enemies like Gobbles or Papu often appears in money hungry levels, and other cost efficient rushers like Fishman is usually usually better as it can burst down Gobble way faster with a significantly cheaper cost. She also has freeze resist talent, which is whatever. Well, despite that, I still recommend at least investing one level into it. The first level is only 5 NP and gives her 16% freeze reduction, which is pretty good for escaping Henry's Small Freeze or against specific bosses like Baku. Honestly, not the worst resist talent she could have gotten, but it's still a resist talent. If anything, her innate weaken immunity is the one that actually gains more relevancy over the years. Remember what I said about how she has this to counter Wing Piggy? So if you don't know, Wing Piggy is quite a threatening enemy due to her big Omni Strike and her powerful weaken ability. Any units that are weakened by her will have their attack power cut down to 10% of its original power for 5 seconds. This makes it so that any non-weakened immune units that gets outranged would be completely ineffective against her. This includes melee units like Can or Manic Island, or any mid-rangers like Seafarer or Pizza or even Courier Cat. So generally, the best way to deal with Wing Piggy would be using attackers that outranges her. And Cyborg just so happens to outrange Wing Piggy's Omni Strike by 10. While Wing Piggy doesn't actively apply the weaken to cat units that outranges her, weaken immunity still helps if Wing Piggy happens to push into Cyborg's range, as it allows Cyborg to continue having her proper damage output for the next 5 seconds if she survives the hit. While there are other options for Wing Piggy like Drama or Slapsticks, as well as Drone or Time Traveler, which are actually pretty powerful for Wing Piggy even without the weaken immunity, Cyborg is still a very valid option because of the weaken immunity that she has and her low cooldown. Speaking of Wing Piggy, I think another stage that she's really good in is Growing Strange. I also have a video explaining about Growing Strange if you want to learn about that. Since condensing your lineup is key in Growing Strange, having a unit that is pretty well rounded for a majority of these stages is quite good. She might not be the best pick on each separate stages, but she's good at nearly all of them. Not to mention the Angel stage, Holy Rat, contains 2 Wing Piggies, and as you'd expect, she does pretty well at it too. Wing Piggy aside, her range in general is still something that not a lot of non-Uber units has. A lot of modern meta mid-ranger units would usually have about 250 to 320 range, and while that's usually enough to function, sometimes you might want that 350 range, you know? There's still several common enemies or boss enemies that can outrange many of these mid-ranger units, but not Cyborg with her 350 range. Hell, sometimes even when you don't exactly need 350 range, just her having high range is a good enough advantage. Cyborg's still a unique enough unit to stand out. Even if you're not in a stage super overflowing with money, she could still be a relatively valid choice of a unit from her good range. And even then, there's still one more thing to consider when comparing her stats with other units. Keep in mind that majority of mid-ranger attacker gacha units are super rares. And since Salon is a common rare gacha unit, the average player would have her at a higher level than other super rares if you use her dupes to level her up. You are going to find more dupes of her since she is a more common unit. I mean, it's not like it's gonna come to the point where her base stats would be higher than other super rares. Cyborg still needs like level 120 to have the same DPS as level 40 Slapsticks, which I don't need to explain why this is an extremely unfair comparison, but hey, she only needs level 60 to have the same health as Slapsticks, while still retaining the significantly shorter cooldown as an advantage. What I'm trying to say is that it's less realistic to compare, say, a level 50 Cyborg and a level 50 Slapsticks, because normally you'd probably already have like an extra like 10 or 20 or maybe even 30 more levels of Cyborg than Slapsticks, or other super rare units in general. And with this kind of comparison, while her stats might still be worse, it's certainly not as terrible as if you compare it to the same level. Now, I want to talk about one of her biggest strengths, which obviously is her extremely short cooldown. When it comes to being a range attacker, Cyborg is amongst one of the best units to turn your money into damage as quickly as possible. Converting your money into damage fast can be more worth than trying to be more cost efficient sometimes, as the earlier you deploy your units into battle, the more damage you can bring into the table. Okay, let's visualize it with this chart. This chart compares a level 40 Cyborg, a level 40 Slapsticks, and a level 50 Cyborg, and seeing how fast they can increase their DPS on the field if you constantly spawn them. Cyborg definitely ramps up in DPS very quickly, but also drains your money as fast. But reaching a high DPS early would ramp up the damage output instantly. Think about it like accelerating a car. Cyborg is a car that has a limited top speed but has a fast acceleration, With instant fast acceleration, you'd have instant advantage at the start in the distance you travel, compared to other cars that has lower acceleration. I hope that makes sense. But this might be a little impractical in nature. If your stack dies, like for example because they pushed too hard and got hit by a backliner or something, then you're just left with no money to defend yourself, which can lead you to your doom. There's ways to circumvent this, for example by luring to separate the backliner or something, but you might not be able to do this every single time. It's certainly still a very valid option to keep in mind though. Even if it's not that 100% always practical, it could actually save you in a pinch on certain stages that gives you money at the start of the level. The instant quick DPS conversion is actually pretty advantageous. You know the saying, offense is the best defense? This is very much true in Battle Cats. Enemies can be stopped not just by defending, but also by hitting them back. You can stagger them if they hit their knockback count threshold or just straight up kill them. Since Cyborg can reach a high DPS very quickly, these Cyborg stack will instantly defend one another through the power of damage. Every successive Cyborg spawn will contribute in maintaining the defense of the stack in the process. More Cyborg, more damage, better defense. Splitting your power to many units also means you're not risking losing too much power focused in just one unit. Also, new Cyborg will always stay at the safest range possible, while the old Cyborgs can act like a ranged meat shield. Look up the ranged meat shield here if you want to know what I mean. For other cat units with higher cooldown, you're going to have a gap in between spawning your units. In these gaps, a lot of things can happen to the existing stack. If there's not enough DPS on the field, they might not be able to defend themselves from the oncoming enemies. This would potentially result with your stack getting wiped. Normally, this can be circumvented by having other units in your lineup to cover for each other, but that could waste some sweet slots in your lineup. Cyborg is a much more independent unit in this case, and this is a trait that's almost exclusive to Cyborg, which is frankly kind of funny given how simple of a unit Cyborg is. Aside from her low cooldown and good range, all she has is decent stats, and yet her advantage in low cooldown alone is enough to make her incredibly unique from the rest of the cast. I feel like the fact that this unit is incredibly old makes it kind of cool, don't you think? Cyborg still unfortunately isn't that amazing in the endgame meta though. Her money consumption issue is still a big problem in many stages, and lots of the current meta units are able to dish out good damage with much cheaper cost. Her being too much of a generalist end up hurting her a little bit, and there's often already a specialist mid-ranger that can deal with specific traits. Many late game stages also often expects your unit to just die quickly, so you just want to dish out damage fast, which is why rusher type units like Can, Courier, or Slime are often the endgame meta compared to generic stackable ranged unit. Cyborg does have stages where she shines even better than her peers, and yet sometimes she might not even find herself being used. Not even because she's a bad pick, but I think people sometimes kinda just forgot about her. Her not being a specialist of any kind makes her not stand out as much, I think. Even in 4-star restrictions, the competition is pretty tight. Despite her good range, she does still need to compete in picks against your legend units like Awakened Ururun, Awakened Minna, Urs, Uril, and so on. You can still find usages out of her in late game stages though, but I think there's this negative stigma towards her that makes a lot of people not even consider her as a valid option ever, even in stages where she's supposed to be good. What's also unfortunate is that I feel like this negative stigma towards her also carries to early game players too. I asked you guys in a community post a while back about what you think about Paris Cat, and reading through it, I think most people generally had a similar idea. You know, used to be a really amazing unit, but it's kinda just good otherwise. Also, a bunch of you said Smash, which is, yeah, very funny I guess. But there's also some comments that thinks that she's overrated or unusable past early game, which is just straight up not true. Yeah, her prime is indeed an early game, but honestly, you can still find valid usages out of her here and there, especially at the end of SOL, and still some usages going in UL or ZL or other event stages. Her 350 range is still very unique and a valuable trait, not just for outranging, but just for survivability in general. And her unique low cooldown is helpful in many cases of just keeping annoying peons like pigeons away, or even chip off metal doges in some mixed trait metal stages. There's no units in the game that outright replaces Cyborg. Her low cooldown for the range that she has is irreplaceable. Of course, she's not as good as in late game than in early game, but I think some people severely undermines how well she can perform if you simply just level her up with her dupes, which is easy to get mind you, and investing in her basic talents. Also, she has a defense up combo if you're bringing her with Little Titan Cat, so if you're bringing her around often, that could be a nice help too. She's also, funnily enough, a valid pick for floor 30 if you can believe it. I also have a video talking about floor 30 if you're interested, but her cooldown allows you to be able to spawn her in between Hermit's attack cycle, and since she have a fast attack startup and good range, she can easily hit anything that is near your base. The damage per hit isn't that high, but it is enough to chip or knock enemies back in a hit. You can use this to juggle the peons to give yourself a little bit more time until your main attacker finishes the job, or to stall until your other units gets off of cooldown, or to finish off a peon that's already been crippled. Money is also not too bad of a problem here as long as you're not constantly spamming Manic Lion to stall. Honestly, if you're trying to beat floor 30 for the first time, or maybe you're just interested in replaying the stage, I genuinely recommend considering Cyborg in your team. She's actually a pretty solid pick here. I feel like Cyborg is in a weird position in how the community views her right now. Since she used to be insanely good, many people held her in high regards. But this also made some people think that she's overrated. Well, in reality, she's really not. The stigma that she's overrated made people think that she's straight up a terrible unit all round, which again is simply very untrue. Her reign over the early and mid game meta has not changed at all. She's not exactly gone any weaker, in fact she's gone stronger over the years. And there's still late game stages where she can work well if people actually remembers her existence in the first place. She's not a meta cat, sure, but she's a great and balanced unit. In the Japanese version, her name is Perfect Cat for a reason, you know? She's perfectly good with perfect weaknesses, perfectly balanced, as all things should be. Anyways, that's all for Paris Cat. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I hope you're more interested in using her now. If you have any thoughts or questions about Salon, Paris, and Cyborg, or maybe if there's something that you think I'm missing about that I should have talked about, let me know in the comments. And that is all. I'll catch you another time. See ya!